Hey, can you hear
Hi,
me?
I can. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Good, good.
Um, Thank you so much for being here. We were so excited to have you come speak to the group and to have your and Kylie's book as our featured April book. I got so many emails of excitement when I announced it. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, I'm so honored. Like to have a book club about your book is you don't realize when you've been in book clubs, you love the book that you do, but to actually be the book is a whole other world. So I'm in deep gratitude for everybody.
Um, no, it's a terrific book, and I'm sure you hear it all the time. But like, really, there was such profound excitement, kind of across the board, um, from many people when I announced it.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to dive in then, and
Yeah,
you know,
let's do it.
we're yeah.
So just to give you like a little preview of how it works, we have some members of the book club who will be joining live, some members who will watch the replay because people are kind of all across the country, and outside of the US. We have a couple people in Canada with different time zones. There's a mix. People have written in questions, and I've curated a select list based on the most commonly written questions.
Yeah.
So you don't need any kind of introduction, but just briefly, Mark Groves is a human connection specialist, a speaker, a coach, a podcast host, and creator or founder of Create the Love, which is an online community that guides people to design the life and the love that they've longed for. And he obviously co-wrote our April book, Liberated Love, with his wife, Kylie, to guide people on how to identify relationship patterns that keep them stuck and to create true intimacy in an environment that fosters and celebrates mutual strength and liberation. Um, as I said, the book is really so wonderful, and I loved the way that you wove in your and Kylie's relationships with your clients' experiences, and you did that so seamlessly and really crafted it in a way in which we as readers felt like we got to know each of you as individuals and also got a sense of your relationship, which was really cool. And I just on a personal note loved seeing references for some of our past book club authors such as Britt Frank and Dr. Alexandra Solomon. So it's cool seeing the different book community authors recognizing each other. um, it's so refreshing to have a book that has multiple perspectives, and I'm curious, in writing the book, how the two of you balanced when each of you was going to incorporate your respective client stories and how writing the process works broadly and doing it together.
Yeah, writing a book together is, we had a kid. We submitted the manuscript for the book the day before he was born.
Wow.
So I would say writing a book together was actually a lot of really good preparation to be parents together because we had very different processes of how we
Yeah.
wrote. Like I'm more of a last minute, the deadline's last week, like let's go. And my wife is more structured, more like scheduled, organized. So there was a lot of tension in that, different ways of being, which I think is similar to parenting.
Yeah.
And so that process was interesting, challenging. I'm not sure if you asked my wife, she'd want to write a book together again. I'm not going to run towards it either. But being able to share both of our experiences was really powerful. I hear a lot where couples will say that the man identifies more with my wife's side of the story and women
Can see
identify more
that.
with mine, which makes
Yeah.
sense from a more anxious or avoidant
Yeah.
style. And how we decided, it was pretty a natural weaving. It was interesting to edit it from the place of a unified voice because we have such different voices writing
Yeah.
wise. Like I'm more offside, I'm more direct, I'm more, all the things. She's more graceful. She has more, like her language is different a lot of the time. So I think it worked out pretty good. And um, it's amazing when you look, when I was reading the audiobook, which after each chapter of the audiobook, we have a shared conversation about the stuff
Oh,
from the
how
chapter.
cool.
Yeah. And that, when I was reading the audiobook, I was really proud of the book. I was like, wow, this is really good. Because when you're writing it in
Sure.
spaces, and then you're editing, and then you're doing it again.
Sure.
But you kind of end up feeling a bit fragmented or distant from the content a little bit. And then you read the audiobook and you're like, oh, yeah, this is good. Like, this is what we needed before.
Yeah, that's very cool to hear. And I'm curious how much of each of your expertise on relationships and liberated love originated from your work versus how much originated from your original relationship together and then the time apart and reconciliation. Like, how much that informed what's now each of your expertise on love and relationships.
Yeah, I'd say the more logistical parts of relating, like attachment styles, that kind of thing, even the nervous system, like from those perspectives, they're like the things you learn, that you could learn going to school or taking a class. It was the moving beyond the upper limit, like understanding your attachment style, great. Understanding how your nervous system responds and how it's correlated, great. Understanding what are your deal breakers and the masks you wear. I think those allow us to put language to then feel like it's like when someone gets a diagnosis, they'll often feel free because there's finally some structure around their behaviors. But really, at the end of the day, like, we're all a collection of behaviors. And so it's like, how do you actually move from being anxious, avoidant, dysregulated to creating security and actually creating a relationship from there? And so many of our, like, I mean, almost every couple I know, and this includes us, ends up hitting a new upper limit of their relational dynamic. And so we turned towards every modality before we broke up. And when we got back together, we were really thinking we hit sort of the resource limit in relationship 1.0. And what we had learned and been guided through couldn't guide us through what we needed to be guided through. So we felt like we just needed to tell our story. And, it's like you can learn how to heal through so many different modalities. And this was just another way of seeing relationship that we thought would offer people a window into their own experience. And I think the part that really felt really important to me was how many subtle ways we create codependency and how much we hide it. Like, I see so much of my own dynamic where we're the anxiously attached, we love all out, we're the ones who are 100% in. That righteousness is actually really preventive from connection. And the problem is that most content will feed that righteousness. Like, the avoidant person's just not ready. They're the ones who are effed up. Really, when I started to see Kylie's ambivalence as brilliant, then I started to see my certainty as actually, my certainty was not actually rational.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yep. No, totally. And I think that both in my clinical work and in the book club, attachment and attachment styles, it's one of the things that people talk about the most, right? It's like a very hot topic, and something that people are often curious about. And I will definitively say that a ton of books talk about attachment styles. The way you and Kylie wrote about it, I feel like captured it brilliantly and described it like so well. And it's, from now on, anytime anyone asks me about reading about attachment, your book is going to be top of the list because I think it explained it so well and explained, how it appears in our body, tangible ways to change it. I think you really did that brilliantly.
Well, I think if you look at the history of therapeutic work, coaching work, it was so much about the logistical part, but it was really absent of the nervous system. And how do you, both are languages and both are, you can't have one without the other. And the more I do my own personal work and work with people, the more I see that the language of the nervous system is actually maybe the easier, faster way to move through things. So I'm curious your thoughts.
No, I definitely think so. And I think that in a lot of the most traditional therapies, we probably don't take it into account enough, right? We talk about physiological responses to thoughts and emotions, and I can speak for myself personally. Most of my training was in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is very, evidence-based, very focused on thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. and obviously I'm a fan of cognitive behavioral therapy, or, it wouldn't be what I do, but I think that we're doing a big disservice by not taking the nervous system into account in our work. And I can, in my, 6 years of my PhD program, we hardly ever talked about the nervous system. And I think it's something that doesn't get enough recognition. And what I loved is that you don't just focus on the nervous response, you really bridge the gap between the two of them, which I think is so important.
Yeah, it's kind of like I used to work in pharma years ago, and I was a GI rep. I worked with a gastroenterologist. This was in the early 2000s, and there was not a conversation about the microbiome,
Yeah.
So I think as we just learn more, we are able to integrate them into the work that we do. And I think it's like some people will completely heal just through the conversation about attachment, and other people will completely heal with just a conversation about somatics. And then someone else will heal through the conversation about people pleasing or codependent dynamics or fixers with or narcissists and highly sensitive people, or borderlines. And, like there's all these different frameworks that we use. I remember Tony Robbins saying that there's no such thing as a stuck client, only a stuck interventionist. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And he said that, I mean, obviously it's controversial to a lot of people, but he said that we only have so many ways that we can express our dysfunction, which I think is pretty true.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. I'm curious, and I'm, eager to get into the questions that people wrote in about. I feel like in the book, and I'm curious if you agree with this, there's more perhaps perspective on the work that Kylie did when the two of you were broken up and spending time apart. I mean, she talks about the boundaries she set with her family. She talks about the containers that she set. I'm wondering, if you can speak a little bit to the audience about the work that you did during the time apart, and if there were actionable steps that you took as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've not heard that question before, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, when we were done the pattern, and for those of you who might not be familiar, I was very much the chaser. My wife was very much like uncertain, certain, not certain, certain. There was a lot of ambivalence, a lot of shifting of goalposts, and it was just so natural. I now look back and I think, okay, I always said I would not date an unavailable person again, and then I dated her, and she really was like 95% unavailable, masquerading as 100, or sorry, masquerading as 100%. Sorry, she was 5% of unavailable, masquerading as 0.
Yeah.
And then it just started to reveal itself. And there's that saying that the deeper the commitment, the more the stuff that will come up. And so as the conversations about deal breakers got revealed, she got a little more distant and would shift them, like when we were going to have kids, get married, stuff like that. And I started to realize that when people shift deal breakers, they really want to see if you stand in them, and they also are often afraid they want to actually end the relationship. So they challenge a deal breaker to see if you'll stand in it, because that really is what will create respect. Because for people pleasers, they don't stand up for themselves. Right. So on a deep level, I wasn't trustworthy because I said all these things, but was I willing to back them up? So by the time we actually got to the end of my capacity for tolerating ambivalence and her capacity for her own ambivalence, I was just done.
Yeah.
I actually hit the place where I was like, I have zero desire to stay in this dynamic ever again.
Yeah.
It's like you can watch, that movie, I think it's called Joy.
Yeah.
It's I forget her name. She's from Hunger Games. Anyways, she all of a sudden just loses it.
Right.
And like just shuts down all the codependent dynamics. And I think for a lot of us, it takes that. For me, during that time, we went to no contact. So there was a lot of really important boundaries that I needed to witness. But I really went into a descent in my own grief. Like a lot of the grief that came up for me was old grief. It was me processing all the different ways in which I'd abandoned myself and tolerated ambivalence for like 20 years, And where did it come from? And where did I learn that? I actually consumed Francis Weller's audio series. It's called Alchemy of Initiation. And he has some great, I mean, it's such a wonderful audio series, but in it, he talks about how the soul likes to dwell in the darkness, that it lives on the edges of your grief. And that really was my experience. I mean, it was the first time I'd gone through a breakup sober.
Yeah.
And so I couldn't numb what was coming up. And in that time apart, yeah, I really doubled down on that. I wanted to process the grief. I wanted to ensure that I would come out more powerful, fitter. You know, a lot of people say get a revenge body. I'm like, well, get that if you want, but get a revenge soul. Like that's and so there really was a lot of standing in the direction of my work, but I also part of my processing was recording podcasts on what I was navigating at that time. And that I remember I sent a podcast episode I sent it to the editor, and he was like, oh, holy man, like, I did not expect to cry during your podcast. And I said, can you like edit out some of the really dense grief that came out of me? Because you know that, you know, people call it ugly girl crying, but it's like you're trying to breathe even, because it's it's from such a deep place that it's cathartic. There's a release that occurs. So my time was really spent in that. And I mean, I didn't go into, like, I wasn't dating at all in that time. I was actually just starting to entertain the thought when she messaged me. But I remember just feeling like, oh, I could have a connection with someone again. And although I spent time thinking about her, one thing that was actually really interesting, which I think created so much more trust in myself, is it didn't matter if an old version of her came back, I had zero interest. And that's why when I say to people, like, when you get back together, that's the wrong term. Like, that infers going backwards. Like, get together moving forward. And if you're so committed to your own growth and expansion, you actually won't even care if it's them. It just happened to be her, and she happened to meet me definitely moving forward. And the way that we came back into a relationship, I mean, she came back as a woman. Like, I was terrified of women before that. And I think it was because they would force me to face my shit, but I didn't have a choice in our relationship dynamic. And then when we broke up, I had to really confront it. I had to, in a lot of ways, that little young version of me had, by finding the word no and no more, I became safe within my own self, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally does. And I think that's a good segue, because a lot of people wrote in. I'm always tickled by like the themes that a bunch of people, you know, are submitting questions or thoughts about. And a lot of people wrote in saying that reading your story, like your and Kylie's story, gives them hope for some kind of reconciliation. And I think that, like, you know, it's an interesting framework of it, right? That you would advocate for not trying to reconcile with that same person. Aside from things like creating relationship containers, are there early signs when one or both people express hope for reconciliation that might indicate whether enough change has occurred, you know, that it could be a healthy relationship?
Well, yeah, so much of people going and changing is often sourced from being left, of course, right? But I think it's so interesting when you ask a lot of men or women who leave, at what point did you want to leave? It's usually quite a bit before. Like, when did the disconnection occur? Did you bring that to the relationship? Often they did. And, you know, I think the data, when I looked at it last, which was probably like 6 years ago, showed that it was about 2 years on average.
Wow.
And it's usually women who end the relationship. So women tend to have a greater barometer for relational health. And I could say that one is because there is just more socialization for that, but also relationship safety is imperative to a female safety. So I remember Harriet Lerner, I said to her, why is it that 85% of the people who follow me are women? You know, when I don't speak to women, I speak to everybody. And I never wanted to just focus on women, because I really felt like I was the one who needed help. So, like, why would I not want to talk to me? And I would say that in general, because the environment hasn't been there for men to feel safe, maybe to consume that type of information based on self-perception, socialization, etc. but she said to me that the subordinate group always has to learn the needs and nuances of the dominant group.
Hmm.
So in order to survive, because male emotion can be dangerous, women have to learn about how to be masters of emotion. And so a lot of that, when people break up, there's often not a lot of clarity. So if someone says, I want space and time, most people actually don't create agreements about that. And let's say it's probably more the avoidant person who's making that choice anyways, who's
Right.
bringing forward this presentation. So what happens is that the person who's requesting it, the other person feels anxious. And so they're like, well, if I ask what you're going to do with this space, you might distance even further.
Yeah.
So they don't create clarity. But actually, there's more self-abandonment. So now we have more self-abandonment. So for me, it's like, if you're taking a break, what are you doing with it? Like, what are you doing with it? Because if I'm the person who is more anxiously attached, I have people come to me. I could say this is almost always true. They'll come to me presenting as having anxious attachment, which I'm like, okay, you're prone to anxiety when you're in what you're perceiving as insecure connections. So you are not that. You just have that. You get it sometimes. It's like a toll. But I'll say to them, tell me about your relationship. And then they'll tell me about their relationship. And I'm like, well, of course you have anxiety. like this is the exact appropriate response to what you're in.
Yeah.
So, and this one person I was speaking to was saying, well, I've been doing somatic therapy for 2 years, working on my anxious attachment. And then they told me about the relationship. And I'm like, there's not enough green juice, yoga, somatic therapy, anything to resolve what needs to be resolved in the relationship dynamic. So in order for a couple to come back together, there needs to be really a lot of clarity in what did you do? Okay, because let's say we didn't create intentional time apart. We just broke up and they said, I'm going to go work on me. Or they said, I don't want to do this. When they come back, there has to be a difference. Otherwise, you're just getting into the same dynamic. And for the person who's been tolerating shit, they have to be like, what's different? Show me.
Yeah.
What did you do? What did you learn? How do I know? And you know, one thing, when Kylie and I came back together, I said to her, I don't trust you. Like, I don't trust you because you told me before you chose the relationship and then you didn't. And then, like, I don't trust you. And she said, you're right. She said, I'm not going anywhere. And I was like, ugh. It was like exactly what I needed to hear. But it still took a while to build the trust back. And, you know, I felt a difference in her system. Like, she was no longer more of that disorganized, avoidant attachment. And, you know, what's interesting is that when we came back together, we created a 3-month dating space container, you know, but everyone's like, what's a container? So we decided to date for 3 months. Container is just the idea that we created agreements around what that looked like to contain it. And I said to her, so we're like fully doing this. We're like back together. And she was like, well, we created a 3-month thing. Like, we're not dating other people. We created agreements about it. And I thought to myself, oh, yeah, my anxiety about the uncertainty of our future makes me want to cling to some sort of sense of safety by saying we're committed. Yeah. But what I realized is that I wasn't actually sure about us, but I was presenting as sure, and upset and would get reactive if she presented as unsure. It was like such a mind F, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, by the way?
Yeah, no, I think it does. And I think that, like, thinking about clinical work and the times that clients of mine, you know, have broken up and then gotten back together, you know, taken a break and gotten back together, they often express, and, you know, perhaps this is more representing the anxious attachment, not wanting to know what the other person was working on or what the other person did when they weren't together.
Yeah, like,
you know, and I think
did you have one night stands? Were you on Tinder? And, you know, all that stuff.
And I think that, you know, to some degree, boundaries make sense in some situations, but I think so much of that might be at the expense of trying to learn about how the other person was trying to work on themselves and the progress that they were, potentially making, that there's just this desire to forget about the break and forget about what had initially broken the two people apart. I don't know if that makes sense, that it's almost a disservice to say, I don't want to hear, let's just, proceed as if nothing happened.
Yeah, I think there's a real avoidance of confronting the truth.
Yeah.
While I would say that Kylie and I didn't get into like the nitty gritty details, like I didn't really even ask her too much.
Yeah.
It wasn't because, to be honest, I actually didn't really care. Because as long as she wasn't hooking up with someone a couple weeks before, like,
right.
Relatively recent, that would kind of, to me, disprove a lot of what she was saying. Yeah. But she wasn't, and she was more forthcoming than to me have to even ask. So that's probably why there was actually a lot more safety in it, and I was too. But I often wonder, like, what is the necessity to know? And I think if someone is repeating old behaviors that were, like, if you're dealing with someone who's a serial cheater, then you'll definitely want to know what's going on when you were apart. If you're dealing with someone who cheated, you're going to want to know what happened in your time apart. And, if someone can't fast from connection, there's a real, like, a lot of people just get right into another relationship and then they break up and then they go back to their ex. And it's like, you're just trying to fill another hole. There's too many puns in that, but you know what
I mean. Jumping into, some specific questions about the book. Someone wrote in, I thought that this was a really interesting one. When does healthy compromise end and the great disconnect begin? The person said it feels like a fine line.
It is a fine line. It's a fine line of learning, because I think a lot of the times we might take what someone else's line is and make it ours, and then it doesn't fit. So I always say to people, because it's a little easier to feel it when it's not romantic related, is I'll say to someone, when you get offered a job and the job is the same as the one you have and the same pay, you're kind of like, but when you get offered a job and it's like new responsibilities, you have no idea what you're doing, it's maybe some more money, but it's terrifying. There's like a feeling in your body that can sense the difference between those two things. We have the access to the same thing. Like, am I afraid to move towards something because it's expansive, or am I afraid to move towards something because it's actually familiar? And I think for the difference between compromise and self-abandonment, to me, compromise is expansive to the connection, and self-abandonment is actually compromising to ourselves and the connection. So that might be something like, let's say we're in a relationship and you say, I really want to do this PhD program, but it's in a different state. We'd have to move there. And I have some goal that's local in the community. Maybe I have a job there. And so I have to, in that moment, we as a couple have to decide what is in service of the relationship and to each of us. And can I put what I desire on hold in service of you and our connection? The only way you often discover when you've made the wrong choice is by making the wrong choice. Because I think a lot of us, if we grew up, especially prioritizing everyone else's needs, we might be quick to agree to the other person's thing. So usually one partner has less of a problem with things being oriented around them.
Yeah.
And the other person has a hard time with things being oriented around them. So the person who has no problem taking up space has to actually help the other person take up space. And the way we do that is by having conversations as a couple, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I imagine too, then if there is someone who's displaying anxious attachment in the relationship, they're more likely to be the one who's I guess not compromising, more who's experiencing the great disconnect because they're so eager to people please, or they're experiencing more desire to be there, be a good partner. Is that correct? That typically the great disconnect is coming from the person who's displaying more anxious attachment?
Yeah, so the great disconnect for the more anxious person is to themselves. The great disconnect for the more avoidant person is to
Is to
other.
the other.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So that recognition for an avoidant person is that sometimes I center things around me because it's safe. So how do I actually maintain a self and be connected to other people's needs and wants? It can be hard, especially if you've been in a relationship dynamic for 20, 30
Yeah.
years. And, especially for the people pleaser too, to take up space can feel
Yeah. Yeah.
like a lot.
And I think it's easy for, in the dynamic of a couple, especially people in a long-term relationship, for one person to take for granted what the other person is giving up, and for it not to be recognized as, giving up something for oneself, because it's just the way the dynamic has been molded over time.
Yeah, actually, you saying that reminds me that the other thing is that when there's compromise for the relationship honors what the person gives up. So there's a true acknowledgement of that, and a gratitude and an
Yeah.
expression. And so there is actually like a shared mourning of that for the other person.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to come back to whatever it is? Like, after we're done the thing for me, what do we do for you?
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah. That makes
great,
a lot of
thank you.
sense.
Yeah.
Someone else wrote in asking about the difference between readiness and eagerness to leave the container of transformation. So I guess if I could interpret it like when someone's ready versus when someone just so badly wants to leave the container that they tell themselves they're ready.
Oh, I see that so much, that when someone creates, let's say, a 3-month, what we call in the book a sacred pause, they take a pause from connection. I'll talk to someone who's been single for 5 years, and they're like, I've been doing a sacred pause for 5 years. I'm like, no, you haven't. You've been single and on Tinder. Like, that's not it. There's some pauses in there, but they're not by choice. And that's important. So what I usually see happen, it's almost like clockwork, is 1.5 to 2 months in. That's when they want to leave. That's when they're done. That's when the almost, or the person who's aligned is they're motivated to leave the agreements they made with themselves. So I'd say if you're feeling really uncomfortable in your own space and in your own decisions and in your own, aloneness, then it's important to double down a little longer, because there will be a time when that goes away, there's that great quote that loneliness is a sign you're in desperate need of yourself. And I think for people who are really eager to leave, when the eagerness comes again, from the place of I can't be in what I'm in. But when it's excitement because you're ready, because you're ready, humans are great at rationalizing all the ways in which we will leave what's good for us for something that's a temporary reward, which I think, social media is a great demonstration of this, that will meet a short-term dopamine need instead of witnessing who we are in relationship to the things that we will abandon ourselves for. So that's really what ends up happening in that time on your own, is you witness your own strength. You witness your ability to say no to things that you normally used to say yes to. And that's a powerful place to be.
Yeah. No, totally. And I'm curious, I think that when someone goes through a breakup, there are people who take that sacred pause. There are people who really experience the grief that I think you and Kylie write, so beautifully about. And I think there are people who are then eager to start dating again, right? And you talk about like getting back on Tinder and stuff like that. And I think it's easy for it to be framed as, this is how I'm going to get over the person, or this is how I'm going to move on. Obviously, not everyone grieves and processes in the same way, but I'm curious what types of patterns you've seen that you would advise against when it comes to healing, from a breakup.
I'm definitely dating, like drinking, doing drugs, dating for sure, one night stands, friends with benefits, booty calls, all the different ways that we call having casual sex. We have a lot of different frameworks for that. There's that, I think it's pretty famous advice, on to get over your ex, get under the next. Not great advice. Moving on, and starting to date someone right away, big red flag. The number one, staying in contact with your ex is one of the worst things you can do.
Yeah.
And I know obviously there's different reasons that people do, like maybe you share children. So of course you've got to at least have a way that you communicate, but you can create boundaries around what that looks like.
Yeah.
You have friends be the people between you. There's a lot of different techniques that you can use, but staying in contact with exes, banging random people or friends with benefits or your best friend and get wasted. Those are all like, you're never moving on. It's just, you're treating the pain of not being chosen with arousal. It's just like another drug and novelty.
Right. And I think so often people will say, I'm going to figure it out as we go. If it's a co-parenting situation where they need to stay in contact and they say, we haven't really set out the parameters of how we're going to communicate and if there's going to be someone, to mediate the discussions, but we're going to figure out as we go. And from my experience, I haven't seen that typically works well, that I think there need to be those really clear boundaries from the outset.
Well, it's the classic continued pattern of someone who's more anxious, who is letting everyone else determine the relationship, the depth of it, the clarity of it, the agreements. So, there's a great saying from the place of, it was from a workplace talk I saw where the guy said that if you don't design your life, someone else will do it for you and you won't like what they come up with. And that's exactly it. I'll hear someone say, I'm just going to go get clarity. I'm going to go ask them. No, create clarity.
Right.
Like, take charge of your life, take responsibility for your life, because your nervous system is really, at the end of the day, the core question it's really asking is, if I need you, will you be there for me? Like, that's self-directed. And if you're letting everyone else decide the agreements and everything in your life, then your system is just flowing with people and you're at their whim. And that creates anxiety. That's a massive, that's going to create anxiety and depression because you don't trust yourself to say, this is my life and I'm going to decide how I relate and what relating is like.
Yeah. And I see a lot of people in the comments agreeing with that. And I think that it's not just, listening to what the other person is saying, but also family members. I know that Kylie in the book talks about the way that she set those boundaries with her family in terms of she didn't want to hear their input in those situations. And I think that often during times in which people are feeling lonely and feeling like they're grieving, that they turn to family or friends to build them up. And obviously social connection is so important, right? I don't want to say, cut yourself off and don't allow any input, but I think often the advice people receive from those who care about them is often whatever the person thinks will make them feel better and not always what's to their benefit or what's realistic. And so I think it's also important to be introspective about the boundaries that are necessary in terms of how many people do you want to talk to about the relationship, how often, like to elicit what you need, but not just take in everything that people are willing to offer.
Yeah. I find too that we need to have that one friend who just tells us savage truths, which is often a therapist or a coach, who's like not sugarcoating that shit. And for a lot of people, people don't realize that there's this really, it's not even that narrow, but there's this space in a breakup where you have this window, and that window is the opportunity for you to actually become everything you are. And when you've been boundaryless and you're going through a breakup and all of a sudden you start setting boundaries, the people around you, family included, they'll have a little more space for you shaking the system because you're shaking the system. And they'll be like, just leave them alone. Like, they're going through something. Great. Like, I say to people all the time, do not waste a good breakup. Do not waste a good divorce. Like, there is so much material that could be processed and moved through. Like, when someone comes to me and they're like, oh, it's over, like, I don't know what I'll do, I'm like, oh, come on, like, cooking. Like, you don't even know what's possible from this. Like, you're going to be fitter, more nourished, more excited. Your body's going to learn how to get into regulation because you're going to have your own back. You're going to heal stuff. Like, if you look at neuroimmunology, like, the body is directly connected to our emotions. So if we can learn how to feel them, process, listen to them, we start to no longer be a prisoner in our own system. And I get excited. Not that I get excited when people go through breakups, but I get excited for what's possible. And I think a lot of the times and this is in our book, we talk about this fierce dedication to the truth. Like, truth above everything, truth above feelings. And that's true, I think, of any healthy human system. Any human system that denies truth over feelings doesn't end up healthy. It's just a giant codependent system, really.
Yeah. I'm curious, and so many of the questions, probably no surprise, that people wrote in were about containers, because it's such a big part of the book. Someone wrote in asking, before creating a relationship container, does each individual in the relationship need to have individual containers?
I think it's necessary that we have experienced ourselves taking a break from our relationship pattern.
Yeah.
I do think there needs to be experienced evidence that when it comes to choosing someone or choosing ourselves, we actually learn how to choose ourselves. I'd say in the dating process, one of the key parts of bringing back in like a whole self to a relationship and another whole self to the relationship, so like two people, is that they both are bringing fully the agreements that they want to make for that dating space, for that dating container. And the other thing I'll say is that whatever your pattern was before, you want to really try to do the opposite. So if you're the more anxious people pleaser chaser, you have to have a fierce dedication to telling the truth, but you also have to acknowledge your hesitancy.
Yeah.
Because that actually will be the catch, is this projection of certainty, which is not real. It doesn't mean, because, I think I just talked to a couple about this. I think it's really important, is that person generally is like, no, but I know that if I found someone who wants to grow, and I found someone who loves all out, and I found someone who's interested in navigating conflict, I can make anything work. Great. I love that. Do not get rid of that. That's beautiful. And if you're in a relationship with someone who's somewhat ambivalent, is that what you're looking for? Is that even possible? No. So that's why you have to maintain access to the part that isn't certain about the other person yet, because they haven't earned that trust. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. And I think, like, in talking about trust, when someone has experienced a breach of trust in a relationship, whether it be due to infidelity or due to lies, whatever it is, what are the steps that person can take? And obviously depends on the situation, but what are the steps that person can take to learning not only to trust other people, but also, more importantly, to trusting themselves and their judgment again?
Oh yeah, betrayals are deep,
Yeah.
Some betrayals are, I would say, considered traumatic, quite traumatic. So, when you look at the idea of trauma, it's like we split. There's the version of us before, and then there's the version of us after. This is going to be a hard truth to metabolize. So I'll say it as gently as I can, which is that any betrayal that you experience outside of yourself is almost always preceded by betrayal inside of you. And so that doesn't mean you created the infidelity. Not saying that. I'm not saying you created any of it, because there's this very I would call it irresponsible perceived binary. That is, that if you are taking responsibility for your role in a relationship, then in some way there's victim blaming. But what I'm saying is that you can be the victim of experiences 100%. And you got no choice but to deal with what you went through.
Yeah.
So how did you participate in what happened? And again, not blaming anybody, of course not, especially if you're young and you're going through something. You obviously don't have a choice, but it's like, what can you learn from it? What is the skill set you would need to know today so you would trust yourself in your own body? So I say that because when you look at things like betrayals, it's just, we could focus strictly on the behavior of the other person, right? If you got a serial cheater, for example, I really want to connect to the part of this person who is cheated on and say, where did you first know? Like, on what date were you like, something's off? Because if I can get to the earliest point of the betrayal that you had with yourself, then we can go all the way back and reconnect with where you disconnected from yourself to maintain connection.
Yeah.
And I want to be really mindful, like, again, clarifying, I'm not blaming anyone.
Right.
I'm saying, though, that what's really important is that you take responsibility for how you participate in dynamics. So when you can actually call out the real truth that you were uncertain on date 5, what happens is on now, we can reconnect to the deeper part of you that you have abandoned in order to stay in connection. And that is like a level of responsibility that I get can be confronting for people, but that's only because it's usually joined with the idea that we think it's our fault. It's not your fault. And self-abandonment is always learned.
Yeah.
You know, so you look up your family tree and you go, well, who else betrayed themselves? You'll find a couple people for sure.
Yeah.
So what a beautiful thing it is that we've now been able to turn towards ourselves and explore this. I think it's helpful to explore that with someone like you or with a coach, because I think to hold the shame that can come from that, or the anger or whatever that is, guilt, is actually, it requires community. That's why you have a book club, because when people hold that recognition together, other people go, oh, me too.
Yeah.
Like, I get 100% of the time when I explore the idea that external betrayals are always preceded by internal betrayals, we always find where it was.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, I think it makes total sense. And I see people again saying, you know, that it's a great point. And I think that that can come in so many forms, whether that be friends or family members, you know, saying, I think you should be cautious, and overlooking it, right? Like trusting this person that you don't know as deeply as these people who have known you a long time, or thinking, you know, I'm going to overlook this. This is a one-time event, right? That, to your point, I don't want to say never, but it's pretty rare that these traumatic betrayals are complete surprises. And so it can be painful, but really essential to be introspective and say, when did that first seed of doubt occur?
Well, think about it. It's like, if even you entered a relationship with a narcissistic serial cheater, and you entered it probably because you're disassociated, and on some level, like, to even participate in that pattern, you've probably been through something, right?
Yeah.
Like, you've probably seen that in your clinical practice, right? So it's not something that tends to just catch a normal, high-functioning, securely attached person. Not to say it can't happen and people can't be duped, 100%. But what I am saying is that if we were to look at it from this other window, which is not saying all life's things are blessings, because fuck that, but saying, if there was medicine that would wake you up, that's the medicine.
Yeah.
I remember Carolyn Mace saying, which Carolyn Mace, you know, I love her. She's savage. Do you know who she's? A spiritual teacher.
Yeah.
And she said, if you were afraid that someone was going to leave you, and you placed like all your worth on that, if I was your angel, I'd send you someone that you would fall madly in love with, and after 3 months, I'd have them leave you. And I think a lot about that. You know, I wrote years ago this idea that whatever you place your worth in will leave you, so that it can remind you that it doesn't live there. And that's not fun. Like, me self-abandoning and being in a relationship with someone ambivalent was fucking hell.
Right.
Pardon my language, but it really was. It deserves an F sharp.
I'm mindful of time. I'll throw in like one other question, maybe. One thing that I personally was surprised that people had a lot of thoughts about was the section where you talk about significant others. Someone's asking for clarification on the name.
Mace, MYSS. And y'all know what's up. I love it.
So, so several people, and I was surprised about this, wrote in strong thoughts about significant others developing hobbies. In that section toward the end,
Yeah.
people saying, that they agreed with that they disagreed with that they'd rather their partner be working than developing hobbies. So, rather than, again, I was quite shocked by it, but one question that someone asked that I picked out amongst the group was, I really resonated with the section on how it can feel threatening when a partner develops new interests, as I'm experiencing that with my husband of 10 years. Are there ways to respect and encourage the desire for new hobbies while still asking my partner to prioritize time spent with family?
That's such a great question because there's this balance. So the system gets disrupted
Yeah.
when this is true of any system. So if you have, I would be curious if the husband was more of the self-abandoner, or the husband is perhaps even using this idea of hobbies as a way of being more distant from the connection. You never know, right?
Right.
I did this talk once on boundaries, and a woman came up to me after, and she told me about how her husband got really into mountain biking. And she was like, it's just, he spends so much time doing it. And I was like, does he still spend time with the kids and time with you? She's like, yeah, but like, I don't go out and mountain bike and do these things. And I was like, well, are you upset that he's mountain biking because you don't take up space to do your own thing too? And we get to the place where she's like, damn, yeah. Like she has spent her whole life self-abandoning in the relationship dynamic. I think this is obviously especially true.
Yeah.
I think even developmentally required of mothers when children
Yeah.
are young. So there needs again to be acknowledgement and space for the compromises and losses. I think there's a deep grief, as much as like our son is 2.
Yeah.
And I witness the deep love that my wife has for our son, but I also know that she is like trading other things for that, and she wouldn't trade it and make it any different. But there still needs to be an acknowledgement of what she gives up. So I think when one person develops habits and new rituals and new passions, ultimately, like, can we create relationships where this conversation can happen, where we could say, hey, I noticed that you're really taking up a new hobby, and I love that for you. It's actually bringing up a little fear for me that it's going to pull you away from the relationship. And I so value our time together as a family, and you with our kids. They love their father. And it just brings up fear. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but what I want to bring between us is to tell you that I'm afraid it's going to create distance between us. Now, depending how long people have been together and how long a pattern has been about, that might cause the person who's developing the hobby to get resistant or reactive.
Sure.
So, there is an opportunity to say like, hey, maybe I didn't approach that the right way, or I'm not saying that I don't love your hobbies. I'm saying that it makes me a little scared. And if I'm taking ownership, like I haven't really prioritized my own hobbies.
Yeah.
So, as you said, there's a lot of layers to how you can look at it. But I'd say if someone else developing hobbies triggers you, I'd say, do you have your own?
Yeah.
Do you have your own self? Do you prioritize yourself? When's the last time you let yourself have it? The other thing I'll say is that if you do develop a hobby and your partner does, and they invite you to participate, I would recommend you participate. Because if you don't, it will create distance, and a lot of people end up leaving and then enter relationships with someone who has a shared passion.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I mean, I agree. And I think I agree with a lot of the points. I mean, I think that often there's some sense of projection and resentment that someone feels like they don't have their own hobbies or don't have the space or permission, although no one in a relationship should need permission, to have hobbies. And so they're often projecting it onto resentment of the other person. And I also think that, I'm a big proponent of, it's great when each individual has their own hobbies and has their, time alone with other friends or family, you know, and stuff like that, but also joint hobbies. But I think I agree with you that even if someone doesn't share an interest with their romantic partner, showing interest in learning about it is really important, right? You don't have to do it every single time, but, you know, ask questions about it. If you don't go, ask how it was, show interest, because I think that lack of interest often drives people apart.
Well, it also demonstrates to the kids that the parents are adults and individuals.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think a lot of the time, because a lot of families, just by design of previous relational structures, there was a lot of centering of the male's needs or the male and more. And I'm not saying this is always true. Obviously, there's going to be people who are like, not us. Okay. But I think for a lot of women, there can be the experience of, but I've given up so much. Like, why are you not giving up stuff? And I get that, because you have given up a lot. But can we exit the righteousness? And really, there's a lot of grief there, but the righteousness that is protecting from the grief and from the lack of an established self, what you've given up for the relationship. That, and the interesting thing is, if you're the one who's more self-abandoning and you've given up your own hobbies for the family, which is, I got to tell you, when you're dating someone and they give up all the things they're interested in for you, it's not attractive.
No.
The hottest thing is someone who's a self. And I would say, you know, Esther Perel talks about how that love likes closeness and connection, and desire likes distance and mystery.
Yeah.
But I would say what really happens, I'm not debating Esther Perel because she's obviously Esther Perel, but what I would say is that desire disappears when a self disappears. Yeah. And it's because unconsciously we blame our partners for the reason that we are not a self. And so we don't want to bang people that we blame for us self-abandoning. Yeah. So that projection or the blame doesn't allow us to reclaim ourselves. And it creates a hierarchy in the relationship too.
Totally.
Which is fascinating.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for coming, for, you know, thank Kylie for me and for the book club, for the two of you writing the book. It really is so wonderful. You know, I have loved hearing your perspectives today, and I know, you know, the entire book club and watching the recording and those who are here today will absolutely love the discussion too. I'm wondering if you can just share, I know that there are many avenues in which people can continue to consume your content and learn from you. You know, if you can summarize where people can find more of your work.
You're so great. Thank you for what you've created. I mean, you've given so many authors and teachers a opportunity to share. And so Kylie and I are both deeply grateful that you've chosen our book, that honestly, we such reverence and appreciation. You can find more of my work at createthelove.com. I have a community called the Create the Love Community, and all my courses are in there. And I work sometimes one-on-one with people or one-on-two, and you can find that at markgroves.com, and there's a coaching application. And just so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.